am delighted to introduce my friend Rich Garzon. Rich was in my cohort in grad school at the University of Arizona and is now a software engineer in New York, proving that you can go into tech and still be philosophically engaged. Importantly, Rich did his undergrad at Rutgers in political science and philosophy, where he also ran a chapter of the United Students Against Sweatshops, organizing protests, fundraisers, and occupations. Also while working with the International Workers' Rights Consortium to coordinate efforts with suppliers like garment factories overseas and tobacco fields in the American South. Rich, thanks for joining.
Hello, hello. It's my distinct pleasure. It's good to see you. Good to see you all. Even though I guess I'm not really seeing anybody, but
Well, we appreciate you being here. So I thought I should start off with a story, which partly explains why I wanted to change previous syllabuses in ancient philosophy that I've used in previous ways that I've taught this material. So I was at a diner one time with my friend Chris. Chris is black and is one of the kindest and most giving people I've had the honor of knowing. And we were having breakfast for dinner, as you should. And I was telling him about the Stoicism unit I was teaching, and I mentioned that Martin Luther King always gets held up as an exemplar of Stoicism. And my friend just stops me mid-sentence and says, "I'm so fucking sick of white people using MLK to tell me to stop being angry." And then he then went on to explain how MLK has been whitewashed in various ways and how frustrating it is that white people don't even consider what other black voices have said about violence and anger and injustice. So to start off, why can it be problematic when white folk tell people of color not to be angry?
I think like when you tell somebody not to be angry, there's a couple of things you can be assuming when you're telling a person that and asking that of them. So there's, asking it in a way that like I think you need to think more reasonably, perhaps for your best interests or for just our best interests, to maybe cool off, and that's like a reasonable thing to ask a person. But I feel like this sort of discussion is like different, right? That like the anger is not just something you should give up on. Being asked to not be angry because we're somehow our anger is like inapt or like unfitting, right? And if we want to address just like the sundry issues that have to do with race in this country in particular, specifically, that's what I know about. Yeah, just asking to not be angry about things leaves out most of people's interaction with the systems that are causing anger, systems of oppression, right? The reason we think, or at least the reason I think is problematic, is because, yeah, we're basically saying, hey, oppressed person, you're reacting to a first-person experience with a system of oppression. Your reaction is an angry one, and we're asking you to just like not have this, right? If you can ask somebody to not be angry for various like instrumental purposes, right? To think more clearly about something, to not say things you don't regret, but to say it because your anger is misplaced is like that's like you're coming from a different place. So to say to somebody who has interacted with society in a way that is very different from the way like maybe somebody else has, and to say that they should feel the same way that like any other given person should is just kind of just like weird, right? And I want to say the word weird because yeah, like I use the word because I just don't get it. It's like you're basically engaging in a conversation with somebody without trying to see the way they might perceive the world or privileging their point of view like at all. So if you just don't have empathy, then it's really a lot easier to just say, hey, like don't be angry about this, right? Because people get angry all the time about things that they perceive as like unfair or unjust, or just things that suck real bad, right? Yeah, like having to see people of your particular identity group be marginalized in particular ways, having to learn about like the history of some of our institutions in America, and just having that kind of like deleted from popular discourse. I think these are just things that not everybody experiences the same way because they can affect you right now and the people you care about right now directly, right? In a way that like not everybody like suffers. I think, broadly speaking, I think that's why it's problematic. So yeah, like an example is, I don't know, Dalmatino. When we lived in Arizona, actually, we lived in Arizona when there was that discussion about that law where a border patrol could just like pull over brown people. Yeah, that's like upsetting, uh, and I'm unhappy about that because it is unjust, but also because I don't know, like I am surrounded by people. I grew up surrounded by people who would be subject to rights violations for like no justifiable reason, and that makes me angry. That's the word I would use. That makes me angry.
It's funny that you bring up that law in particular because that was one of the experiences where my whiteness like struck me in the face because my dad was visiting from New Zealand and we've driven down to a town in southern Arizona and on the way back there was a border check and that law requires that all non-American citizens carry all of their documentation with them at all times. I
Mhm.
did not have any of my documentation and we got pulled over by this cop and he asked for it and I just said I don't have mine with me and he said, "Well, you should," and then I got sent on my way. It's like that
Wow,
is not an experience that other people would have had who did not look like me.
that's insane.
One of the quotes that comes up in one of the articles that we read is by James Baldwin, and he says that to be black in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. What would
Mhm.
you say to someone who said that it seems like an overreaction?
So to be conscious of your position as like a member of a marginalized group in America is to be in a rage all the time. I think I really like that quote for two reasons. I'll get to the question to explain like kind of why I like it. Because he's kind of connecting. So before when I said that like anger, dismissing somebody's anger because you think it's inept is different from asking them to set aside their anger. So like maybe it's like a good idea for now, maybe we cool off or whatever. Is because you're basically saying like you were being emotionally immature. You were having inappropriate and emotional responses to things. These are not things you'd say to somebody who you think is like reasonable, right? Or like a rational person, which is why I think even saying I think sets something off. So in this case, I like the Baldwin quote because he's saying to be conscious of your status as being a member of a group and having a grasp of like history about where that group has kind of found itself in like the various strata of like socioeconomic power in your country or community. So just he's basically saying like if you understand these things and you're a member of one of these groups, it's just apt to be angry, right? So he's just saying like if somebody asks you to dismiss your anger for that reason because you're doing anger wrong, that's just like incorrect, right? And I think there's a lot to that thought, right? Um, and like I said before, like these aren't just like abstract things. Like we see this all the time. Like the studies about there's like people's resumes who have non-white sounding names being like desk rejected at a higher rate than people with more mainstream like white person names, I guess. These aren't just like ideas. They're not just like a couple paragraphs in history books. Uh, they persist. What he's saying is we should just be like it's reasonable to be angry about this.
So, for
But
part of the class, I assign primarily Black voices, in part because I think they present a lot of issues about anger and race really eloquently and powerfully. But these
mhm.
issues obviously affect a lot of communities. We're talking about systemic injustices and we're talking about widespread oppression. Are there any other communities or identities that you think are worth highlighting in these kinds of discussions um, that you can speak on?
Yeah, so these are discussions about these identities and I guess like anger, right? In the political sphere. So I'm reminded of I listen to like a lot of podcasts, which I'm not doing a lot of anymore since I'm not taking the train to work. But I listened to an interview. I believe it was Ezra Klein with Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker is known for in talking about history and politics, kind of advancing this line that like the values of I think like the Enlightenment are one of like the biggest drivers of the respecting of human rights, general more equitable outcomes, and more important than anything else, kind of just like economic growth and innovation that's made people's lives better. That's his whole like thing. Like if you look at the last books he's written, like that's about it, right? in the course of this interview, it became apparent, and this is implicit and sometimes explicit in his work, that those virtues are like the soul, and that virtues and other and drivers of change that might have to do with feelings like anger, right? Or feelings that there's a system of oppression that's holding certain people back, right? This doesn't kind of jive with the whole history is kind of a constant progress thing that his books are about. So during this interview, I remember he was asked a question about like the development of gay rights and the acceptance of basically non-heteronormative peoples of various stripes in America. And I think I forget what the answer was, but it was something like, "Oh, it was because people had civil discussions about like LGBTQ issues, and then like these discussions spread through America, and it convinced enough people, and it like trickled up to the the legislative and opinion making classes, like media people, politicians, think tanks, that they just adopted the laws." And the first thing that the interviewer said in response to that was, "Do you know about like the Stonewall Inn riots? This was just like trans people of color basically just like breaking shit in New York City and just saying like we're not going to accept like the coercive arms of the state, like in this case the police. We're not going to accept their basic just like harassment mentality, right? Like the injustice, like state-sponsored injustice." And that was an angry movement. They were unhappy about it, right? Um, like I think this is another quote somewhere, but it's like, yeah, like, you can't really debate with somebody who doesn't accept your basic humanity as like a like right like you just can't debate them. So it was like an interesting interview. It's interesting to see this worldview that's very kind of like anti-anger, pro-rationality. Like all we need is like a discussion, kind of clash with actual history and the way things like actually happen, right? Like you don't. I think like King said this in letters to Birmingham, letters from Birmingham prison. Like the oppressor doesn't just like hand uh, the oppressed their freedom or their liberation has to be taken. And yeah, anger helps with taking stuff. So I broadly think that's I think a good example of an identity group that's relevant to this discussion.
So I wanted to invite you to say more about this because often people will say that if you want to make a change in your society, then you should stay calm and work slowly in lawful ways to make society better, like using the existing institutional structures that are designed to promote these kinds of discussions. When it comes to issues like racial and structural and economic inequalities, why is this a really simplistic way to think about widespread solutions?
I think there's two related points to make that would answer this question. So there's one point about when your structures are failing you and they're unjust and your institutions are failing you. So one pillar is I think these sorts more sort of I guess emotional. I don't know how to describe these things, like emotionally related, popular movements are usually contraposed to going about things like in an institutional way. But I think that's not like a really. I don't think that dichotomy holds up. In my experience of politics, that dichotomy is angry-ish, emotional movements have overthrown institutions in the past, right? That's just like what revolution, the American Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, right? People do use these kinds of this, like the spirit of these movements are angry and are anti-establishment. So I think that to ignore the efficacy of these sorts of motivations in like motivating large numbers of people to kind of just look at their institutions and be like, nope, we're done with you. We shouldn't overlook how valuable that is. But I also think that we still need these kinds of movements, these kinds of emotionally motivated things to even make things happen inside of our institutions, right? So I think we tend to think of things like our legislatures, like town councils, or whatever our democratic decision-making bodies are as being these like august, civil, suit and tie, don't raise your voice. But I don't think that's necessarily true in real life. And I don't think it should be because, I mean, politics, which is just, for me at the base level, how to distribute finite resources among a group of people, right? Um, you're going to have quite opinions about how things should be. Somebody else is going to have different opinions. And those are like moral beliefs. And if you don't have feelings about your moral beliefs, then I don't really think you have moral beliefs, right? You just, I don't really know what you are. It's weird to me. So I think it's legit to, yeah, invoke feelings of anger. And in my experience, I know like Jeremy, you mentioned, I was like an organizer, I guess, community organizer. It's a good catch-all description. Um, yeah, we never ever taught rational argument to convince people ever. No, if you encountered people who disagreed with you, you hand them off to somebody so that they don't distract people who are listening to you. And then you use things like, like shame and peer pressure to get them to show up to your actions or otherwise participate in your work. Um, so like in my experience of politics, just like is that it's an emotionally laden thing, and I don't see why that's bad because um, once you've decided what you think is good, you should like realize it, right? And I don't see why that should be an unemotional thing.
One of the really interesting passages in Seneca's on anger is he grants that anger has this really, really powerful rhetorical force. And so, even in the most famous treatise saying why you should never get angry, he says, well, sometimes when you're talking with people in politics, you have to fake it. Otherwise, people won't believe you and won't think that you're serious. So it seems like even from the Stoic perspective, where it's like, well, ultimately emotions are harmful for yourself. Sometimes you still need to fake them in order to get politics done. And I just think that's a really interesting moment of concession in the treatise on a whole. It seems to be validating what you're saying. That there comes a point where, like, if you need to get people to get stuff done, you need to get emotional, or at least they need to think that you're emotional.
Yeah.
So Baldwin, right after the famous quote that I mentioned before, he goes on to talk about how you have to find ways to set aside that same rage so that it doesn't destroy you.
Hmm.
And something that's really interesting in the Audre Lorde Uses of Anger piece that I assigned, she says that the same rage can be channeled so that it's creative and productive in various ways. What do you think that
Hmm.
creative, productive anger looks like? Like, what is that to you?
I had the same question. Like, what is she's talking about that it can be useful and it can be valuable, but I was kind of like, well, I would like an account of that, right? I guess what I think she meant was people who have this sort of anger, and this isn't just like anger that like I stubbed my toe or I'm angry that I, forgot to bring my wallet to the grocery store, right? This is like anger at specific, uh, like social, political, or moral outrages or things that you consider a moral outrage, right? I think it's useful because you can use that to motivate people uh, to action, right? Like I was canvassing for a politician here in Brooklyn, where I'm from, and and they give you talking points, right? And they send you to neighborhoods where they know certain things have happened to certain people, and you bring these topics up, and it makes them mad, and then they're like, tell me where to go, right? And yeah, it's just that's useful, right? Otherwise, they're just going to be pissed off, and they're not going to know what they can do to kind of alleviate the state of affairs that is the object of their anger. So the example here was, I remember some guy was like, every 4 days somebody comes to my house just handing me a wad of cash to buy my property because I want to build like a 6-story, like hipster development, like new building, whatever, and just get people are trying to get the families out of this neighborhood that have lived here for. So yeah, they gave us a sheet of paper to talk about landlords, development companies, and you didn't have to do that much talking. Like people were like, "I know exactly what you're talking about. It, I am angry about it, and I would just like for my community to persist in its current state. And we've lived here for a long time, no." And then, you hear their personal stories, and then you just kind of just all you have to do is nudge, just say, here's how you can alleviate your anger. Basically, like here is an action you can take. right? You can feel like you did something, right? Because I feel like anger, at least for me, reaches like a resolution when you can like feel like find closure on the object. Because otherwise, you're just right. Like that person never knew this person politician was running. If they never thought that they could do anything about it, then you're just angry at a world you can't change. And yeah, that sucks. And I think that maybe that's what Baldwin's talking about. Like I'm not an expert, but yeah, that's a consuming a rage without an end.
So I wanted to finish by asking you about one of the empirical claims that the Stoics make, just to get your 2 cents on it. The Stoics think that whenever anger motivates you, you can think rationally about the same injustice, the same source of that anger, and you can
Mm.
rationally recognize that it's wrong without getting angry, and then that rational recognition is just as motivating as the anger itself. And in fact, does a better job at kind of promoting those productive ends. Do you think that's empirically false?
Um, I have no idea. I feel like I would have to be a psychologist, but um, so basically, it's like rational recognition that something wrong has happened is just as motivating as having the attitude of anger towards a state of affairs. Huh. I'd probably say it's like empirically false. I don't know. Like in my experience, it's empirically false. Again, like to the work I did as an organizer, like there was never nobody thought that yeah, like winning an argument with a person was a productive way to spend your time organizing. It's mostly just about figuring out what people are personally, developing a connection, and explaining to them how they can like assuage their sadness or their discontent, ways they can healthily resolve like their anger. Um, which I guess is just helping people because you're basically saying like, I know things are tough. Here's some bad feelings you might have. Here's how you can get like rid of them. And in my experience, people are more motivated than by just like they already know rationally like something is wrong, right? But could I just have a basically it's like could I talk to a robot who is suffering these injustices, has no feelings? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. My experience, no. But I feel like I'd have to do some social science to answer this question.
That is all good. I am totally happy to finish my course on a big question mark. Rich, thanks for talking with me. I always like talking with you too.
Thanks, man. You too. Good to see you.
Yes,